Hey guys, tonight we begin in a bed that's too small, too crowded, and definitely too close to your in-laws. You're lying shoulder to shoulder with your siblings, your parents, maybe a grandparent snoring in the corner, and yes, maybe your new spouse right beside you. The room smells like smoke onions, and the earth beneath the rushes on the floor. There's no door to close, no mattress to sink into, and no such thing as a "do not disturb" sign. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where even sleep wasn't sacred and sex was never private. You're going to hear about communal bathhouses, wedding night audiences, confessions that traveled faster than pigeons, and why privacy as you know it just didn't exist. And fair warning, if you value personal space, you probably won't survive 5 minutes in this world. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're tuning in from, drop your location, and what time it is in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're inside a one-room cottage, probably somewhere in rural France or England. It's evening. The fire's low. You pull a woolen blanket over yourself, scratchy, itchy, reused for generations. The floor is packed earth. The ceiling's low and black with soot. The whole family's here, including the baby, gnawing on a chunk of bread, and the dog curled up near your feet. This is where you live, eat, argue, and make love. Not just you, but everyone. In many medieval peasant homes, the idea of private space simply didn't exist. That's not an exaggeration. Most people lived their entire lives in one shared space with no internal walls. If someone wanted to get intimate, the options were limited and creative. You might drape a coarse cloth around the bed or whisper under the blanket while others pretended not to hear or didn't bother pretending. People were used to it. There was no real expectation of privacy and even less embarrassment about the basics of life, sex included. And about those beds, many were just sacks of straw on the floor or shared wooden frames called family beds. Sometimes multiple generations crammed into the same mattress. The logic was simple: warmth, space, survival. Emotional discomfort wasn't a priority when the goal was not freezing to death. You see, warmth equals life. This is a world without central heating, where winter kills as efficiently as the plague. So people huddle. Sharing body heat is less about romance and more about not becoming a frost-covered corpse by sunrise. Think of it like an awkward sleepover that never ends. Now here's a mainstream historical fact. In early medieval England, particularly in Viking-influenced areas, it was common for the whole household, including servants and children, to sleep in a single space with no separation. It wasn't scandalous. It was normal. And here's your quirky detail: some medieval households trained their dogs to sleep under the covers, not as pets, but as mobile, furry hot water bottles. Romantic, no. Effective, surprisingly. But back to you lying there in this room where sex, sleep, birth, and death all happen side by side. You're trying not to move too much. The bed creaks. Someone farts. The fire pops. You glance sideways at your spouse, and you both know there's no moment tonight that will go unnoticed. And even if you were wealthy enough to live in a larger home with multiple rooms, privacy still wasn't guaranteed. Wealthy houses had servants, and servants had ears. Courtiers gossiped, pages lingered, and because beds were expensive to heat, guests often shared them. That's right, noble travelers routinely bunked together, fully clothed or otherwise. Think medieval Airbnb, but with zero privacy setting. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly lacked a concept of privacy, or whether they just accepted its absence out of necessity. Did they grow numb to the lack of personal space? Or did they find secret ways to create emotional boundaries, even when physical ones were missing? Whatever the case, one thing is clear. Sex happened with an audience, whether real or implied. Whether it was the toddler beside you or the neighbor whose cottage wall was a single timber plank, a way someone always knew. And that knowledge wasn't kept quiet. In small villages, everyone knew who did what, with whom, and when. Gossip moved faster than carts, and accidental observations very common. You'd think twice about cheating on your spouse when the neighbor could literally hear your moans. Also, medieval society didn't always view sex through the same shame-tinted lens we do today. Sex was natural. It was a part of life like farming childbirth or brewing beer. That's not to say it wasn't regulated. Oh, it absolutely was. But the shock factor wasn't the same. There was an earthy practicality to it all. Peasants didn't have the luxury of moralizing when survival was the main goal. If the bed was warm, the house was still standing, and nobody had died of plague that week. You were doing pretty well. So as you lie there swaddled in linen that smells like smoke and sheep, try to imagine a world where the idea of closing the door on intimacy just isn't real. A world where sex isn't whispered about behind closed doors. It happens openly, routinely, and often within earshot of someone who might casually mention it over breakfast. Later in this story, we'll head to the noble courts and monastic cells, but for now, in this simple cottage, you learn that privacy is a modern luxury. In the Middle Ages, you shared everything: your food, your faith, and yes, your bed. The morning light creeps through the cracks in the wooden shutters, and you're already awake because the rooster didn't care that you barely slept. Someone rolls over beside you. Another coughs. A baby starts wailing. Welcome to dawn in the Middle Ages, where sleep is short and mornings arrive with the subtlety of a catapult. You stretch carefully because you're one wrong move from elbowing your sister-in-law in the nose, and rise into a space that smells like wood smoke, sweat, and something slightly fermented. It's time to start the day. But you're not done learning about just how public life was here, especially when it came to intimacy. Let's leave the cottage and walk toward town. Cobblestone streets the smell of bread from a communal oven, and the very public centerpiece of medieval community life, the bathhouse. Now, before you start picturing a spa day, let me set you straight. These weren't luxurious marble palaces like Roman baths, though they were inspired by them. Medieval bathhouses were hot, humid, noisy, and full of naked people who absolutely weren't there just to get clean. Imagine you're entering one now. You stripped down like everyone else. Men and women often shared spaces, at least in earlier centuries. Steam rises from a large wooden tub. You lower yourself in. It's hot, comforting, and yes, crowded. Conversations bounce off the walls, political gossip, marriage arrangements, maybe a few off-color jokes. And here's a mainstream fact: in cities like Paris and London, public bathhouses were everywhere during the 12th to 14th centuries. They were seen as wholesome, social, and hygienic until plague paranoia and religious reforms started shutting them down. But here's your fun, slightly awkward tidbit: bath attendants sometimes offered, let's say, additional services. In fact, some bathhouses doubled as brothels, especially in areas where regulation was spotty. The German word for bathhouse, Badstube, became associated with prostitution, so much so that reforms by the church often targeted these bubbling hubs of bodily interaction. Now, you're in the tub, maybe shoulder to shoulder with a neighbor. You recognize someone from church. You try to look at the ceiling. The water smells faintly of herbs and old wood. Someone's singing. Someone's definitely flirting. It's hard to say whether people are here to clean up or pair off, but both happen openly. Sexual privacy. Out the window, bathhouse walls were thin, and their reputations even thinner. If you disappeared into one with someone a little too often, people noticed. And yet, going to the bathhouse wasn't scandalous in itself. That's the tricky duality of the medieval mind. Public acts didn't always mean public shame. Historians still argue whether mixed gender bathing was as common as some records suggest, or whether later observers exaggerated the licentiousness to push moral reforms. Some church officials definitely thought it was too much fun. Pope Pius II, for example, condemned public baths as sinful distractions. But many medieval citizens didn't seem too bothered. After the bath, you wrap yourself in cloth, walk home, still damp, and continue your day with a strange mix of cleanliness and community gossip. The line between personal and public life remains blurry. And don't get too excited about bathing alone at home. It's not happening. Most homes didn't have private tubs, let alone hot water. But maybe you're not a city dweller. Maybe you're a traveling merchant. In that case, you'd often find yourself lodging in inns or boarding houses. And guess what? Shared rooms, shared beds. There's a reason bedfellow was a literal term. You didn't just share a drink, you shared a mattress. If you're lucky, the person you're sharing with doesn't snore or talk in their sleep. If you're unlucky, they do both and try to cop a feel. It was such a common experience that some travelers wrote about the etiquette of bed sharing, like no spooning unless invited. Now imagine you're lying in one of those shared beds and suddenly someone knocks on the shutters. It's a neighbor, or worse, a local priest doing his rounds. Because even though privacy didn't exist in practice, it did exist in theory. The church kept a close eye on sexual behavior, especially when it came to unwed lovers, extramarital trysts, or same-sex encounters. Which leads us to one of the most surreal medieval institutions, public confession of private sins. If you had sex outside marriage, word might spread, and if it did, you might be called in front of your village or parish. Public penance could mean standing barefoot in the snow or parading through the streets in a shift holding a candle. Humiliating, definitely. Effective sometimes. But, and this is critical, while shame was weaponized, it was also communal. Everyone knew everyone else's business. There was no hiding behind a closed bedroom door because bedrooms didn't have doors. So you learned to accept it, to whisper quietly, to communicate through glances, to slip away when others are asleep or at least pretending to be. And if you're caught, well, it becomes dinner conversation for the next week. Privacy as a concept exists mostly in your imagination, and sex as a part of life is woven into the daily rhythm of cooking, cleaning, praying, yes, gossiping. Even monks and nuns who swore oaths of chastity and lived behind cloistered walls weren't exempt from temptation. We'll get to them soon. Spoiler, they have stories. But for now, back in the bathhouse, steam, or the creaky bed of a roadside inn, you come to realize that privacy was a luxury, and not one the average medieval person could afford. That's not just architectural, it's cultural. Life was built on layers of shared existence, where bodies touched, voices carried, and even the most personal acts were only ever half hidden. So sleep lightly. Your secrets have paper-thin walls. You wake up with someone else's elbow in your ribs, and the unmistakable sound of chickens arguing outside. Not that you expected silence. Privacy, remember, isn't really a thing around here, especially not when it comes to sex. Last night you overheard someone giggling under a shared blanket in the corner. You pretended to be asleep, of course. That's the unspoken rule. But now it's morning, and you've got chores to do, animals, to feed, bread, to bake. Still, your mind keeps returning to the question, how did medieval people actually view sex, not just in terms of privacy or lack thereof, but in its role in daily life? Well, strap in. Because in the Middle Ages, sex wasn't just about desire or reproduction. It was deeply tangled in ideas of sin, virtue, power, and sometimes even holiness. Let's start with the church, because if anyone had opinions on what you were doing with your body, it was them. Medieval Christian doctrine taught that sex was ideally only for reproduction, and even then, only within marriage. Anything else, lustful, dangerous, a surefire ticket to eternal damnation. But here's your mainstream historical fact. Despite this very vocal doctrine, church officials kept detailed manuals, yes, manuals on sexual sin. These penitentials outlined exactly what was sinful, how sinful it was, and what kind of penance you'd need to cleanse your soul. Spoiler, the list was very long and incredibly specific. Example, if you had sex standing up, that was bad. On a Sunday, even worse. While fasting, triple sin points. Historians still argue whether these strict prescriptions were ever followed in real life, or if they were more like the fine print on a medieval morality contract, technically there, but mostly ignored, unless someone got caught. Now here's your quirky tidbit. One 11th century bishop actually banned sex on Thursdays. Why? Because it was the day of Christ's arrest, and apparently nothing killed the mood like betrayal and Roman soldiers. Some lists banned sex on Friday's day of crucifixion, Sunday's day of resurrection, and feast days, which meant at one point nearly half the calendar was off limits. And yet, people didn't stop. Not by a long shot. If anything, they just got more creative or careful. So while the church warned of fiery punishments, villagers leaned on tradition and practicality. Marriage, for instance, was often more about property and alliances than about intimacy. Couples might be paired off at 13 or 14 sometimes without even meeting beforehand. You're walking through a small village now. You pass a thatched cottage where a couple is being married, not in a chapel, but in the front yard surrounded by neighbors. The priest mumbles Latin. There's a loaf of bread, a shared goblet of wine, and maybe a few awkward glances. The ceremony is brief. And just like that, they're bound socially, legally, sexually. But here's the kicker, that marriage didn't have to be performed by a priest. In fact, for centuries, a marriage was considered valid as long as the couple said they were married in front of witnesses. There was no license, no paperwork, just vows, intent, and maybe a down payment on a pig. That brings us to the so-called bedding ceremony. You've probably seen it dramatized in historical films, newlyweds escorted to bed by family and neighbors, sometimes with music, always with teasing. The crowd might linger, waiting for proof the marriage had been consummated. Sometimes they even stayed in the room. Yep, watched, or listened through the wall. Sex and community were not separate. You didn't just marry the person, you married into their network. So proving that the marriage was real wasn't just tradition, it was legal evidence. In some regions, disputes over land or inheritance hinged on whether a couple had truly sealed the deal. Imagine the pressure. And now say you're single, unmarried, maybe a little curious. Good luck. Because courtship was no private affair either. If you flirted too openly, people talked. If you slipped away behind the stable, people really talked. Even hand-holding could be seen as a contract in progress. But here's the strange part. Despite all this supervision, medieval people weren't prudish in the modern sense. They joked about sex. They told bawdy tales. They carved obscene images on cathedral columns and scribbled dirty verses in the margins of holy books. Go ahead, picture a monk hunched over a manuscript, pausing to doodle a bare-bottomed man chasing a goose. It happened. Frequently. That's the contradiction at the heart of it all. Sex was sacred, sinful, funny, feared, and fully integrated into daily life. You just had to know when to laugh, when to confess, and when to shut up and churn butter, So you make your way through the market where a group of women are trading gossip between cabbages and candles. One of them mentions a neighbor's daughter caught sneaking out after dark. There's a flicker of judgment, but also a knowing smile. Everyone remembers being young once. And yes, they all know what that smile means. By the time you reach home, you've seen a wedding heard a rumor and passed a painting of Saint Mary Magdalene looking suspiciously glamorous. You remember the church's rules, the town's expectations, and the way eyes follow you if you linger too long with someone unmarried. There's a rhythm to medieval sexuality. Public yet hidden. Suppressed yet everywhere. It lives in stories, in laws, in jokes passed over ale. And as you fall into bed tonight, once again sharing your sleep space with a family member, a neighbor, or a spouse, you understand something fundamental. Sex was never private. Because life was never private. Not your meals, not your thoughts, and definitely not your desires. Now try not to blush when someone steals the blanket. You wake before dawn this time, your breath visible in the air, your toes aching from the cold stone floor. The hearth's gone out again. Someone's snoring softly, and you're careful not to step on anyone as you reach for your cloak. It's another day in the Middle Ages, and you're still living cheek to cheek with your extended family and occasionally their livestock. But before you even stretch or rub your eyes, a faint noise catches your attention, a creak, a shuffle, a muffled giggle. Two figures slip behind a hanging cloth in the far corner. And just like that, the morning starts with a reminder medieval people didn't wait for appropriate hours to express their affections. They lived so closely together that waiting wasn't always an option. Today, though, you're focused on where all these behaviors actually took place. Bedrooms, please. You'd be lucky to have a bed at all. So let's wander through the sleeping arrangements of medieval households and explore the flexible geography of intimacy. Mainstream historical fact first. In most peasant homes, the family slept in a single room, often a single bed, especially in colder months. The bed was a shared, prized piece of furniture passed down generations. Parents, children, and even servants might sleep in shifts. And if you think sleeping is all that ever happened in there, well, surprise. There's this charmingly awkward term for it, bundling. A practice where young unmarried couples were allowed to sleep in the same bed, fully clothed sometimes with a wooden board or bundling bag between them. Sounds innocent enough, until you realize how often babies followed. Historians still argue whether bundling was intended as harmless courtship or a convenient path to premarital bonding disguised as restraint. Now, for the quirky detail, nobles didn't exactly have more privacy, just more elaborate public settings. In aristocratic halls, beds were often tucked behind thin curtains, surrounded by servants' dogs and gossipy courtiers. In some cases, a monarch might hold court literally in bed, dressed in silk and propped up by pillows, while advisors stood just feet away. Talk about multitasking. Imagine trying to conduct a clandestine love affair under those conditions. Good luck. Everything was on display, either literally or just a whisper away from becoming public knowledge. You head toward the local manor house, your feet crunching on frost. Inside, a lady's chamber awaits, but it's not just her space. Her maids sleep there. Her attendants brush her hair there. Suitors visit there. And sometimes her husband drops in, with the rest of the household more or less pretending not to notice. In castles, even kings and queens had very little true solitude. A royal bedchamber might contain furniture, tapestries, books, and 5 to 10 humans, depending on the hour. Body servants, advisors, ladies-in-waiting, all part of the set dressing. Some nights an affair might bloom behind a tapestry. Other nights you're just trying to find a warm place to collapse before dawn. But back to you. You pass a row of peasant huts, each no bigger than a modern garage. Smoke curls from the roofs, and outside, a child tries to shoo a goat out of the kitchen. Inside, maybe a couple of benches, a cook fire, a pile of straw. No closets, no doors, no do not disturb signs. It's all communal all the time. And yet, despite the cramped quarters, people still made room for love, lust, and every shade in between. Human instincts, after all, are quite adaptable. Sometimes couples sneaked out to barns or haylofts. You walk past one now and hear a rustle up in the rafters. Maybe it's just mice. Maybe not. Barns were the de facto honeymoon suites of rural Europe, warm, dark, and just private enough. If you were truly lucky or wealthy, you might own a tester bed. That's the fancy term for a bed with curtains often ornately carved and passed down like heirlooms. These weren't just for decoration. They were sound barriers, draft blockers, and symbolic walls in a world without drywall. Behind those heavy drapes, a couple could whisper sweet nothings or simply breathe in peace. But here's where it gets funnier. Those same curtains also trapped smells. You know those smells. So the privacy they offered came with an air of commitment. Romantic, right? Speaking of smell, that brings us to hygiene, which was, let's say, variable. There's a persistent myth that medieval folks never bathed. Not entirely true. Public bathhouses were a thing especially in larger towns. People visited them for actual cleansing gossip, and sometimes something a bit steamier. Bathhouses often had gender-segregated hours, but enforcement was, shall we say, casual. There's a 14th century German woodcut that shows couples bathing together, flirting under the suds. Some bathhouses gained reputations for being more brothel than spa. So much so that in some cities, church officials campaigned to have them shut down entirely. Historians still argue whether these bathhouses were central to community life or a moral disaster waiting to happen. Either way, they provided one of the few semi-private spaces where people could disrobe both, literally and socially. So you peek into a town bathhouse before the noon bell rings. The heat fogs your vision. Bodies shimmer in the steam. There's laughter splashing and someone strumming a lute. For a moment, the boundaries between public and private seem to blur. Again. And that's the theme, isn't it? Medieval spaces weren't neatly divided. There were no private lives in the modern sense. Bedrooms were gathering spaces. Beds were multifunctional platforms for sleep, childbirth, death, sex, and snack time. If you wanted to find a moment of intimacy, you had to carve it out, sometimes literally between straw pallets and curtain folds. By sunset, you're walking home again. A group of children are chasing each other through the square. A dog trots behind you. And as you enter your shared home, someone's already in your spot on the floor. Typical. You make do curling into a warm patch of hay, pulling your cloak tighter. You hear whispers nearby. Familiar ones. And you realize, not for the first time, that in this world, sex isn't hidden away. It's folded into the rhythm of life, loud, soft, awkward, ever-present. And maybe you're starting to get used to it. By now, you're beginning to accept that privacy, as you know, it is more of a modern luxury than a medieval norm. But tonight, as you wander the crooked alleys of a 13th century town, something catches your attention, an open window candlelight flickering inside, and voices rising in rhythmic chant. You pause. The voices belong to monks reciting their evening prayers. No moans, no giggles, no shuffling behind a curtain this time. Just solemn Latin echoing off cold stone wall. But don't let the piety fool you. Because even within monasteries and convents, those supposed fortresses of celibacy, intimacy, found its curious little cracks. Let's start with the mainstream fact. the Catholic Church officially enforced clerical celibacy from the 12th century onward. In theory, monks, nuns, and priests were expected to abstain from sex entirely. Their bodies, like their minds, were meant to be devoted to divine things. In practice, well, there's a reason medieval penitential handbooks had such oddly specific categories of sins. Take the case of the night visits. There are records, many actually, of monks sneaking out of their cells at night to meet with women from nearby villages. These weren't necessarily grand romances. Sometimes they were transactional. Other times they were ongoing relationships kept secret for years. In one notorious abbey, a monk reportedly fathered 7 children with a single milkmaid. Monastic discipline indeed. And nuns. Well, the convent wasn't exactly immune to temptation either. One German abbess in the 15th century was investigated for turning her convent into a full-on pleasure den. Historians still argue whether that case was wildly exaggerated by her political enemies or a rare peek into what some cloisters really got up to behind closed doors. Now here's your fringe tidbit. Some monks practice something called mutual confession, not just as spiritual release, but as emotional bonding. Certain documents suggest this practice, while meant to purify, may have tipped into emotional intimacy. And in rare cases, physical. Was it romantic platonic? A little bit of both. The records are frustratingly vague, leaving modern scholars raising their brows and sharpening their pencils. Still, in the strictest abbeys, punishment for breaking the vow of chastity could be severe, ranging from public penance to permanent exile. One Benedictine monk was famously paraded naked through the village before being locked in solitary for the rest of his life. You imagine the humility lesson probably stuck. But beyond punishments and piety, you come to realize that even the monastic world couldn't escape the reality of human desire. These were people, not robots. And despite vows and rules, their bodies didn't always obey. You walk past the monastery's orchard where the trees are bare, their gnarled limbs catching the starlight like claws. It's quiet and the air smells faintly of crushed apples. The orchard has stories too. Places like this remote, shaded, sweet-smelling offered rare opportunities for solitude. And occasionally, for not-so-spiritual rendezvous. Inside the convent kitchens, whispers once passed like steam over boiling pots. A new novice arrives, and suddenly Sister Margaret is doing a lot of extra prayers. Or maybe just lingering longer than necessary after compline. It's subtle mostly, but not always. Some nuns wore secret tokens from lovers hidden under their habits. A dried flower, a ring, a lock of hair. One daring letter preserved in a Flemish archive includes a love poem written by a nun to another woman, expressing longing so intense it still reads hot centuries later. Historians still argue whether this was spiritual longing dressed in flowery metaphor or an honest-to-goodness romantic relationship. But not all scandals stayed secret. In 1318, Pope John XXI investigated dozens of Italian nuns accused of unchaste behavior and found more than a few guilty. Some were defrocked, others were sent to stricter convents, like a religious version of boarding school. But even then, the system couldn't really stop what the heart or the hormones wanted. You pass the cloisters now, the arches whispering with wind. A candle flickers in a cell window. Somewhere in that silence, you sense both restraint and yearning. It's complicated. Because while medieval religion held up chastity as a holy ideal, it also obsessed over sex. Not talking about it wasn't an option. Preachers spoke of it often, warning, condemning, confessing. Entire sermons were devoted to avoiding the occasion of sin, which could be as minor as sharing a smile with the wrong person or walking too close in the market. Even bread sellers were suspect if their necklines dipped too low. But what does that tell you? Not that people didn't think about sex, but that they absolutely did. Constantly. Monastic life didn't eliminate human instinct. It just redirected it. Or tried to. So you keep a-walking. Past the monk copying manuscripts by candlelight, his hands smudged with ink and his brow furrowed. Past the nun polishing a brass crucifix, pausing only when she catches you watching. There's no dialogue here. Just glances, gestures, moments. And in this world, that's often all you get. And maybe that's what makes it all feel so real. The Middle Ages weren't a black and white movie with all the juicy bits edited out. They were messy, emotional, full of conflict between what people were told to want and what they actually wanted. Even behind monastery walls, privacy was limited and temptation loomed. Celibacy wasn't always silence. It was tension, rebellion, struggle, and sometimes surrender. You leave the abbey grounds at last, the bell tolling the hour behind you. The chant fades, the candle goes out, and somewhere inside, someone is still praying, or pretending to. You step back into the bustle of the village, where the idea of sex being anything close to private feels downright laughable. Here everyone is a witness to the most intimate details of each other's lives, because the walls are thin, the streets narrow, and gossip is currency. The mainstream fact you need to keep in mind is that medieval homes were often single-room affairs. Imagine sleeping, cooking, and everything else happening in one shared space with family members, servants, and even livestock often crammed under the same roof. Privacy. Hardly a concept. Now, for a quirky tidbit, in some regions, it was common for newlyweds to sleep on a communal bed surrounded by family or neighbors as a kind of witness to the marriage consummation. This bizarre practice wasn't just about voyeurism. It was a social safeguard to confirm the bride's virginity and validate the union. Talk about pressure on the wedding night. Historians still argue whether this was more about community control or genuine concern for marital fidelity. But either way, your modern idea of getting some alone time is hopelessly out of reach. You trudge through the village square where the market vendors shout their wares and children dart between stalls. The scent of fresh bread mingles with less savory smells, manure, sweat, and the occasional whiff of something fermented a bit too long. This is real life in all its gritty, unfiltered glory. Nearby, the communal bathhouse serves as a social hub. Here, clothes are shed along with social status, and everyone from peasants to minor nobles mingles in the steaming water. Nudity isn't a secret shame, but a shared experience with little to no modesty expected. The concept of private bathing practically non-existent. You overhear snippets of conversation, a widow's lament about her late husband's energies, a blacksmith bragging about his latest conquest, laughter erupting from a group of teens teasing each other mercilessly. These voices, raw and unfiltered, fill the air like music or chaos, depending on your tolerance for noise. Yet despite all this openness, certain lines are drawn. Public sexual acts, or fornication in public, were punishable offenses, sometimes with fines or public humiliation. Still, enforcement was patchy, and everyone had their own threshold for what counted as too public. The village tavern offers another layer to the story. It's here you find bawdy songs, crude jokes, and rumors flying as freely as the ale. In a time when literacy was rare, oral storytelling kept the community's collective knowledge alive, including tales of lust, betrayal, and scandal. You notice the tavern's walls are adorned with crude drawings, some depicting heroic battles, others shockingly explicit scenes that would make modern censors blush. These images serve as both entertainment and cautionary tales, reminding patrons of the joys and dangers of desire. As the sun dips below the horizon, you realize that in medieval village, life sex wasn't a hidden act. It was woven into the fabric of daily existence. visible in the crowded homes heard in the marketplace, gossip, and even joked about in the local alehouse. In this world, privacy wasn't just rare. It was almost an alien concept. Instead, what you get is community with all its messy, noisy, and endlessly fascinating details on full display. You slip away from the village bustle and into the shadowed halls of a medieval monastery, where the story takes a different turn. Here, celibacy is the rule, but that doesn't mean sex and privacy are far from the mind. Far from it. The well-known fact is that monasteries were not just spiritual centers, but also places where ideas about the body's sin and secrecy were fiercely debated. Monks took vows of chastity, but human nature being what it is, temptation was never far off. Here's a quirky tidbit. Monks sometimes used a device called the chastity belt, or at least something akin to it, though historians debate whether these were practical tools or more symbolic warnings against lust. The very idea of locking away sexuality to enforce purity seems both serious and absurd in hindsight. Historians still argue whether chastity belts were widespread or mostly myth fueled by later sensationalism. But either way, the tension between public religious life and private desire shaped the culture of secrecy. The monastery's walls are thick, muffling sounds, but also trapping secrets. You can almost hear the whispered confessions and furtive glances exchanged in shadowed corners. Privacy here is enforced, but fragile, constantly threatened by suspicion and moral policing. Monks kept detailed journals and illustrated manuscripts, but rarely did these contain anything explicit, at least not openly. Instead, sex was cloaked in allegory, metaphor, and moral lessons. Sexuality was public knowledge and theological debate, but hidden in personal expression. You find yourself wondering, how did these men reconcile their natural urges with their public roles? The answer lies in confession and penance, a ritual both intensely personal and yet paradoxically deeply communal. In the monastery, privacy means discipline rather than solitude. Every private sin becomes public when confessed to the abbot or fellow monks, turning internal desires into communal concerns. Beyond the walls, the clergy's influence shaped medieval society's approach to sex, promoting openness about reproduction, but strictness about morality. Sex wasn't private because it was under constant scrutiny, both divine and human. As you wander the cloisters, you reflect on the strange balance of secrecy and exposure control and temptation, a dance that kept the medieval world endlessly fascinated and frustrated by its own desires. You step into a medieval castle, a world apart from the crowded village and the austere monastery, yet still caught in the same tangled web of public and private. Here, sex isn't exactly on display, but it's far from a private matter either. The fact to hold on to is that medieval nobles often used marriage and sexual relationships as tools for political alliances and power plays. The bedroom was a battleground where dynasties were made or broken, and secrecy was more about strategy than intimacy. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some nobles reportedly kept spying chambers near the bedrooms, allowing trusted servants or even spouses to eavesdrop or peek at romantic encounters. Imagine living in a palace where your sex life might have more spectators than a football match. Historians still debate whether such spying was common or mostly exaggerated gossip, but the possibility itself highlights how privacy was often sacrificed on the altar of power. You wander the stone corridors and vast halls, imagining the whispered intrigues and secret liaisons. Courtiers traded favors and secrets, and every marriage bed was a stage for more than just romance, sometimes even for scandal. Despite the castle's grandeur, thin walls and the constant presence of servants meant little room for personal privacy. Nights could be interrupted by unexpected visitors or spying eyes, and rumors spread quickly, often becoming tools for political maneuvering. You find it ironic that the very wealth and status that promised luxury also brought public scrutiny to the most intimate parts of life. Privacy wasn't a given. It was a privilege that few could afford, and even fewer enjoyed. In this aristocratic world, sex was less about private pleasure and more about public performance duty and reputation. The boundaries between personal and political blurred with consequences that rippled through generations. As the candlelight flickers, you realize that medieval privacy, especially regarding sex, wasn't about shutting others out, but managing who got to watch when and why. Power played voyeur, and everyone had a part in the grand, often uncomfortable theater. You find yourself in the bustling streets of a medieval town, alive with noise smells and the chatter of townsfolk, where the public eye is relentless and privacy is practically non-existent. Sex here is as communal as the marketplace. A well-known fact, many medieval towns had public regulations about sexual behavior, including rules about where and when people could meet or engage in intimacy. For example, couples might be expected to sleep with doors open or in rooms that were not fully sealed, reducing privacy drastically. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some places, neighbors could call the town watch if they suspected illicit liaisons, turning everyone into part-time voyeurs or moral guardians. Imagine your nosy neighbor as the medieval version of reality TV. Historians still argue whether these regulations were rigorously enforced or more of a social ideal, but either way, the message was clear. Sex was a matter for the community, not just the couple. As you weave through the narrow streets, you notice how the line between private and public blurs. People knew each other's business, and privacy was often sacrificed for social order. Even bedrooms weren't truly private spaces, but shared or easily observed. The town square might host festivals where bawdy plays and songs about love and sex were common, openly performed for all to see. These public displays reinforced social norms and often mocked those who stepped out of line. You might think that such openness would foster honesty, but it also led to gossip, scandal, and the policing of behavior where reputation mattered as much as desire. Surprisingly, despite this lack of privacy, people still found moments of intimacy and tenderness, but always under the watchful eyes of the community. You can't help but wonder, how would you cope knowing your most private moments were potentially public knowledge? The medieval town's answer seems to be, you adapt or you suffer the consequences. As the sun sets and the town quiets, you're left with a vivid image of a world where sex was never truly private, but always part of the social fabric stitched into daily life. You step into the quiet shadows of a medieval monastery, where silence is sacred, but curiosity about sex is anything but absent. Here, celibacy is the rule, yet human nature keeps making things complicated. A key fact is that monks and nuns took strict vows of chastity, but instances of sexual activity within monasteries were surprisingly common, often leading to scandalous rumors and disciplinary action. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some monks reportedly used coded drawings or humorous marginalia in manuscripts to hint at or joke about sexual matters, proof that even in places devoted to spiritual purity, the topic of sex sneaked in. Historians still debate whether these behaviors were widespread or isolated incidents, but the tension between ideal celibacy and real human desires was a persistent struggle. As you walk the cloisters, you sense how the strict rules created a paradox. Intense repression fueled secret liaisons, while confession and penance added layers of complexity to sexual life. The monastery was also a hub of medical knowledge, with monks compiling texts on human anatomy and reproduction, though always cloaked in religious language and caution. You might imagine the corridors echoing with whispered confessions and furtive encounters, a hidden world beneath the serene exterior. The idea that sex was never private rings true here too. What happened behind the monastery walls was rarely just a personal matter, but connected to religious discipline, community reputation, and spiritual salvation. This environment shaped a unique medieval relationship with sexuality, where secrecy and exposure were two sides of the same coin. So in the silence of sacred stone, you discover that sex in medieval monastic life was anything but private. It was an ongoing, if quiet, drama played out behind closed doors. You find yourself in a medieval noble's castle where grandeur masks a surprisingly communal approach to sex and relationships. Unlike the privacy you might expect, everything here is shared, observed, and strategically controlled. A well-known fact, noble marriages were often arranged for political alliances, and consummation was sometimes witnessed by trusted servants to verify its occurrence. Yes, sex is official business, not private pleasure. A quirky tidbit is the existence of chaperones who might supervise young nobles' romantic encounters, ensuring propriety or preventing scandal, turning intimacy into a theatrical performance. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or symbolic gestures, but the underlying truth remains: privacy was often sacrificed for power, reputation, and lineage. As you wander the stone halls, you notice the delicate balance between public duty and private desire, where sex served the family name inheritance and social order more than personal fulfillment. Noble chambers often had multiple beds or shared spaces, making true privacy rare. And the walls themselves might carry the whispers of spy servants, or even rival factions eager for gossip. Surprisingly, despite the surveillance, passion found its way in secret love letters, hidden rendezvous, and the occasional rebellious affair remind us that medieval nobles weren't just political pawns, but humans with desires. Imagine the pressure of knowing your most intimate moments might influence your family's future, or even a kingdom's fate. You realize once again that sex in medieval noble life wasn't a private indulgence, but a public matter intertwined with power and politics. The castle's grandeur fades as you step back into the night, leaving behind a world where even love and sex were matters of state, far from the cozy privacy you take for granted. You now find yourself in a bustling medieval village where life unfolds in close quarters and secrets are hard to keep. The idea of privacy, especially about sex, is nearly non-existent here. A common fact is that homes were often one-roomed with entire families sharing the space, meaning that sexual activity was rarely, if ever, behind closed doors, if there even were doors to close. Here's a quirky detail. Some villages held public beds or communal sleeping arrangements where several people would sleep in the same room, making personal privacy almost impossible. Historians still argue whether such communal living was voluntary or out of necessity due to poverty and housing shortages, but either way, it shaped how intimacy was experienced. As you imagine the sounds and smells of this village, the crackling fire, the chatter, the occasional laughter or argument, you can almost see how awkward, funny, and candid those moments must have been. Sex was part of everyday life, discussed openly sometimes, even with bawdy humor and public teasing. There was little shame in the physical act itself, but social norms and gossip kept people on their toes. You might stumble upon a village festival where marriage and fertility rituals were public affairs, blurring lines between celebration, religion, and sexuality. Sexual knowledge was passed around in communal storytelling songs, and jokes making privacy a foreign concept. So here in the heart of the village, you witness how sex was never a hidden matter, but a shared thread in the fabric of daily life, loud, messy, and entirely visible. You're now peering into the intimate world of medieval medical practices where sex and the body were studied, but never with a modern concept of privacy. A well-known fact is that medieval physicians often consulted openly about reproductive health, sometimes even in public spaces, reflecting a communal approach to the body. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medical texts recommended bizarre treatments for sexual ailments, like wearing animal parts or bathing in certain concoctions, because why not add a little magic to medicine? Historians still debate whether these treatments were truly believed or mostly placebo, but they reveal a fascinating mix of science, superstition, and culture. You can almost hear the bustling medieval clinic with patients sharing their symptoms aloud and the doctor's advice mixing with whispered rumors about fertility and desire. The church's influence shaped much medical thought, framing sexuality as both natural and sinful, a paradox that made medical care about sex a delicate balancing act. Medics often worked alongside midwives and herbalists, whose knowledge was practical, but sometimes viewed with suspicion, especially if it strayed into the forbidden knowledge of sexual pleasure. Privacy. That concept didn't really exist. Your neighbor's family and even your local priest might know about your sexual health long before you did. This openness could be a source of comfort or embarrassment depending on who was listening. But it underscores how medieval society integrated sex into public discourse. As you step away from the doctor's table, you realize that medieval medicine treated sex as a communal concern, not a secret shame, sometimes helpful, sometimes downright strange, but always public. You now wander into the shadowy world of medieval law, where sex was not just a private matter, but often a public offense, with consequences played out before entire communities. A historical fact is that laws regarding sexual behavior, adultery, fornication, and rape were frequently enforced in public courts or by community councils, emphasizing social control over private life. A quirky detail emerges: some punishments involved public humiliation, like the infamous ducking stool for women accused of promiscuity, blending spectacle with discipline. Historians still argue whether these legal actions genuinely deterred misbehavior or simply reinforced patriarchal power structures by policing women's bodies more than men's. Imagine the tension as townsfolk gathered to witness trials, gossip swirling like smoke, and the accused standing exposed, not just physically, but socially and emotionally. Sexual transgressions weren't just moral failings. They threatened social order, inheritance rights, and family honor, turning intimate acts into public scandals. The church courts often worked hand in hand with secular authorities, blurring lines between sin and crime, reinforcing how sex was tightly monitored. Even consensual relationships could be scrutinized if they challenged norms around marriage class or legitimacy, making sex a highly political issue. So as you watch the court drama unfold, you sense a world where privacy was a luxury few enjoyed, and sex was a communal matter bound by law and reputation. The echoes of gavel strikes fade as you move on, leaving behind a society where your most personal acts could become public spectacle at any moment. You find yourself amid a medieval feast where social rituals intertwine with sexuality in ways that might surprise you today. The boundaries between public and private blur even further in these lively gatherings. A historical fact is that communal meals often included playful, even risque entertainment songs, jokes, and dances that openly referenced sex and desire, making these topics part of the social fabric. Here's a quirky tidbit: some feasts featured mock weddings or bawdy plays that lampooned courtship and marriage, turning sexual matters into communal amusement. Historians still debate whether these performances served as harmless fun or subtle social critiques of contemporary norms and hypocrisies around sex. The feast smells of roasting meats, spiced wine, and the murmur of laughter as guests share stories that mix truth, exaggeration, and innuendo about their own and others' romantic escapades. You realize that these occasions weren't just about eating, but also about reinforcing social bonds through shared, often loud sexual storytelling, privacy left at the door. Here, flirtation and sexual politics play out in full view as alliances are formed and reputations made or ruined under the watchful eyes of the crowd. The whole event is a sensory overload, music, voices, clinking goblets, and a reminder that in medieval times, sex was a public performance as much as a private act. As the night winds down, you feel the weight of this communal world where personal and sexual lives were woven tightly into the public tapestry. You step into the private chambers of a medieval noble, a space meant for rest, but often far from private when it came to sex. A well-known fact is that beds even in noble households were frequently shared spaces, sometimes hosting guests' attendants, or even children, blurring the line between privacy and spectacle. Here's a quirky tidbit. It wasn't unusual for servants to be present during intimate moments, either to assist or as witnesses to ensure heirs' legitimacy, making the bedroom more of a stage than a sanctuary. Historians still argue whether this practice was a strict necessity for lineage or a symbol of power and control within noble families. You can almost hear the faint creak of the canopy bed, whispers exchanged between noble lovers and their attendants, with the ever-present tension between desire and duty. The presence of onlookers could both affirm social status and serve as a check against scandal, turning private acts into political theater. This challenges your modern notions of intimacy, as the medieval bedroom was as much about appearances and inheritance as about love and pleasure. Even royal marriages involved public rituals and ceremonies surrounding consummation, making sex an affair of state rather than private affection. So as you imagine these shared nights, you see a world where privacy was sacrificed for lineage, reputation, and social order. Sex was never truly private. The candlelight flickers shadows, dancing on tapestries, reminding you that behind closed doors, the audience was never far away. You drift into the streets of a medieval town where sexual encounters sometimes unfolded in the open, quite literally, under the eyes of neighbors and passers-by. A solid historical fact is that city regulations often forbade couples from seeking privacy in certain public spaces, reflecting communal control over sexual behavior. A quirky detail. Medieval graffiti sometimes included body images and sexual jokes etched on walls, turning public spaces into open forums for sexual expression. Historians still debate whether such graffiti was a form of social rebellion or simply crude humor tolerated by the community. You imagine yourself ducking behind a market stall, aware that your neighbors might be watching or at least hearing your most intimate moments with little shame attached. This public exposure wasn't just about control, but also about a collective tolerance and sometimes celebration of human sexuality woven into everyday life. Sex was part of the public soundtrack, moans mingled with merchants' cries and children's laughter, making privacy a fleeting concept. Even laws punished those who tried to hide their acts, enforcing the idea that sex was a communal responsibility, not a solitary indulgence. As the sun sets and street lamps flicker on, you grasp how medieval townspeople accepted and even expected the lack of sexual privacy as normal. You step back realizing that for all our modern ideas of discretion in medieval times, sex was an open book story, told in full view of the village. You find yourself in a medieval church where sex was paradoxically both condemned and controlled, yet never truly hidden from communal scrutiny. A well-known fact is that the church imposed strict rules on sexual behavior, but its courts often investigated private sexual matters, making confession a public affair by proxy. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some clergy used peeping windows or secret holes in confessionals to monitor penitents' behavior, blurring the line between privacy and surveillance. Historians still argue whether such invasive practices were widespread or exaggerated stories meant to critique church authority. You feel the cold stone walls press in as you hear whispered confessions of sins, sexual or otherwise. Knowing that these admissions could ripple through the community, Sexual morality was policed not only through sermons, but by neighbors and family members reporting immoral acts, turning private lives into public spectacles. Yet paradoxically, the church's rituals also offered a space to talk about sex openly, albeit cloaked in guilt and repentance. This tension meant that sex, though often seen as sinful, was deeply entangled with social and religious life, making true privacy nearly impossible. You sense the weight of judgment in every corner, the ever-watchful eyes of both God and community blending into a constant, uncomfortable presence. As you leave the shadowy nave, the clash between sacred secrecy and public exposure lingers. Sex was never quite private under the church's gaze. You wander through a medieval festival where public celebrations often blurred the lines between propriety and open indulgence. A solid historical fact, many festivals included rituals and games that encouraged flirtation, sometimes even public sexual acts, all in the spirit of community and seasonal cycles. A quirky detail in some regions, villagers engaged in courtship dances so explicit that modern sensibilities would blush, turning public squares into theatrical stages of desire. Historians still debate whether these festivals served as a social safety valve or risked undermining the era's strict sexual norms. You watch the crowd's laughter and knowing glances, understanding that these moments of loosened restraint were socially sanctioned breaks from daily discipline. Sexual behavior at festivals was not about privacy, but about communal bonding, shared pleasure, and the reaffirmation of social roles. The open air and raucous atmosphere meant that modesty was often the first casualty, replaced by playful exhibitionism. Yet these public moments paradoxically reinforced the community's moral boundaries by marking clear times and places for such behavior. As torches flicker and music swells, you sense the pulse of a society that both feared and celebrated sexuality, never quietly, never privately. You realize that in the medieval world, sex was part spectacle, part social glue, woven tightly into the fabric of communal life. You drift into a medieval home where the walls are thin and privacy is a rare luxury, especially when it comes to sex. Historically, homes were often shared by extended families, with little separation between bedrooms, making sexual privacy practically impossible. Here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes newlywed couples were expected to sleep in the main hall where the entire household could witness their first night together. Historians still argue whether this practice was meant as a genuine communal rite or a form of social control over young couples. You feel the creaking wooden beams and hear muffled voices, knowing that neighbors or relatives might overhear everything, blurring the line between public and private life. Even the design of medieval houses discouraged seclusion. Few had doors that locked, and windows often lacked shutters, exposing inhabitants to outside eyes. Sex was less a private matter and more a shared family affair, with gossip spreading quickly through the village. This lack of privacy shaped attitudes toward sex, where shame was less about secrecy and more about how behavior impacted the community. As you imagine the flickering candlelight and whispered conversations, it's clear that medieval homes were less sanctuaries of privacy and more stages for communal living. You realize that the very architecture of the time worked against sexual privacy, making it something rare and precious rather than expected. You stroll into the bustling streets of a medieval town, where public baths served as social hubs, places where privacy about your body and sex was simply not on the agenda. A well-known fact, public bathhouses were common gathering spots for all classes, where people bathed, chatted, and sometimes even flirted openly. Here's a quirky tidbit: some bathhouses had designated mixing times for men and women. Yet rumors persist about secret trysts occurring in the steamy corners. Historians still debate whether these spaces facilitated casual sexual encounters or were primarily hygienic and social institutions. You notice how the steam blurs the sharp edges of modesty, and how the sound of splashing water drowns out whispered secrets and laughter alike. Sexual encounters in these public baths weren't private if they happened at all, but part of a broader culture where bodies were communal. Despite church disapproval, such public spaces thrived, showing how medieval life often balanced moral codes with everyday human desires. You feel the warm, humid air wrap around you, mingling with a faint scent of herbs and smoke, as you realize the contradictions of medieval social life. Public baths remind you that in a time before bedrooms locked tight, privacy was a luxury reserved mostly for the elite. The baths were where public and private blurred, making sexual privacy a concept foreign to many. You step out into the cool evening, the memory of laughter and splashing water reminding you again sex wasn't a secret, it was part of the communal experience. You find yourself in a medieval marketplace, where the everyday mingles with the risque, and where bawdy jokes and sexual innuendo float through the air as freely as the scent of fresh bread. One historical fact, markets were not just centers of commerce, but also places where flirtation matchmaking and even casual sexual encounters sometimes took place openly. A quirky detail jesters and performers often included ribald humor and suggestive songs in their acts, turning the marketplace into a theater of sexual expression. Historians still debate how much these public displays challenged or reinforced societal norms around sexuality. As you weave through stalls and chatter, you notice how sexuality was embedded in daily life, not hidden away, but woven into the fabric of community interaction. Sexual jokes and teasing weren't considered vulgar, but rather a common language, a way to navigate social relations and hierarchies. The marketplace's open nature meant that sexual expression wasn't just tolerated. It was often expected as part of the human experience. You catch a merchant winking at a customer, a reminder that flirting was a form of social currency. In this lively hub, sex was far from private. It was a public performance, a dance of glances, words, and gestures. You sense that medieval marketplaces were not just economic centers, but vibrant social spaces where sexuality thrived openly and unabashedly. You enter a dimly lit medieval tavern where the air is thick with smoke, laughter, and a hint of something more daring sex as a public spectacle. It's a well-documented fact that taverns were hotspots for socializing gossip and sometimes illicit liaisons. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some taverns had room rentals that were basically medieval love hotels, complete with minimal privacy and plenty of eavesdropping opportunities. Historians still argue whether these spaces were merely pragmatic or if they played a bigger role in shaping medieval sexual culture. You hear the clinking of mugs and raucous laughter, knowing that whispered rendezvous could be happening just a few steps away, often under the watchful eyes of curious patrons. The tavern's layout, often a single room with shared spaces, meant secrets were hard to keep, especially those involving sex. Despite the church's condemnation of taverns as dens of sin, they remained essential venues for human connection and desire. You realize that in this world, sex was rarely private. It was a social event, sometimes scandalous, sometimes celebrated, but never fully hidden. As the fire crackles and shadows dance on the walls, you feel the raw energy of a place where bodies, words, and desires intertwine publicly. You leave the tavern aware that medieval nightlife was a world where privacy was sacrificed for communal experience. You wander through a medieval festival, a carnival of sights, sounds, and smells, where the lines between public celebration and private indulgence blur delightfully. Fact: festivals often included games, dancing, and even courtly love rituals that brought sexuality out in the open. Here's a quirky detail. Some festivals featured mock weddings and bawdy plays that humorously exposed sexual themes giving everyone a chance to laugh at taboos. Historians still debate whether these events acted as a safety valve for repressed desires or reinforced strict societal roles. You watch as villagers join hands in lively dances, their eyes twinkling with mischief, while merchants sell trinkets and sweetmeats nearby. The air vibrates with flirtation, playful teasing, and the occasional scandal whispered behind veils and smile. Sex at festivals wasn't private. It was part of the communal revelry, celebrated with humor and sometimes wild abandon. Even church authorities struggled to contain the carnivalesque spirit that temporarily upended the usual rules of decorum. You feel the warmth of bonfires and hear the music rising, sensing how festivals offered a sanctioned break from everyday restraint. The medieval festival was a place where sexual expression was temporarily liberated from the usual watchful eyes. You leave knowing that for a few magical days, medieval society allowed sex to step out of the shadows and into the dance. You step into the somber, echoing halls of a medieval monastery, where silence reigns, but where thoughts, and sometimes desires, roam wildly free. A key historical fact, the monasteries enforced strict celibacy, yet records show monks often struggled with these vows, sometimes keeping secret relationships or indulging in forbidden pleasures. A quirky tidbit, some monks attempted to channel their desires into artistic expressions, creating risque marginalia, those tiny, naughty drawings in manuscript margins. Historians still argue about how widespread such behaviors were and how seriously the church took internal transgressions. You imagine the quiet corridors and cloisters where the contrast between solemnity and hidden human urges created a potent tension. The irony is, thick spaces meant to suppress sexuality also became places where it was subtly acknowledged, mocked, or even artistically celebrated. You realize that medieval religious life wasn't immune to sexual complexity. It just masked it under layers of ritual and secrecy. The marginalia, sometimes playful and shocking hint at a medieval wink, an acknowledgement that sex, though publicly condemned, was never fully absent. You sense that in these hushed walls, privacy was an illusion. Secrets were shared in art whispers and forbidding glances. The monastery's paradox mirrors the broader medieval world. Sex wasn't private, but deeply entangled with social and spiritual life. As you leave the cloister, you carry with you the image of a world where even silence held a sexual subtext. You find yourself in the bustling courtyard of a medieval town, where justice and spectacle intertwine in a way that would make a modern courtroom blush. A well-known historical fact, public punishments for sexual crimes like adultery, fornication, or sodomy were not only common, but served as social warnings. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some punishments involved public shaming rituals such as the pillory, or forced parading in humiliating costumes, turning offenders into living cautionary tales. Historians still debate whether these public spectacles genuinely deterred immoral behavior or simply reinforced community bonds through collective scorn. You watch the crowd gathering a mix of curiosity, judgment, and sometimes sympathy as the punished endure their fate with varying degrees of dignity. In this town, square sex is not just private pleasure, but a matter of public concern entwined with laws and morality enforced with no small measure of theatricality. The community's gaze is relentless, and privacy is the first casualty of any sexual misstep. You sense the weight of communal morality crushing down on individuals, reminding everyone that their intimate lives are never truly their own. Yet within this harsh reality, you spot moments of human resilience. Friends and family quietly supporting the humiliated, hinting at a more complex social fabric. As you leave, you reflect on how medieval society made sex a public spectacle to maintain order, a practice both brutal and oddly familiar. You drift through the smoky interior of a medieval tavern, where laughter ale and whispered secrets mingle in a haze thick enough to blur the boundaries between public and private. Historically, taverns served as key social hubs where talk of love, lust, and scandal flowed as freely as the drinks. A quirky fact, bawdy songs and ribald jokes were staples of tavern entertainment, openly discussing sexual escapades that no respectable chamber would dare admit. Historians still argue whether taverns were subversive spaces, challenging norms, or simply outlets reinforcing social hierarchies through gossip and exclusion. You overhear a group of patrons sharing exaggerated tales of conquest, their voices rising and falling like a medieval podcast, complete with laughter tracks and dramatic pauses. The tavern's smoky shadows conceal stolen glances and flirtations, offering a space where sexual talk was less taboo, even if actual acts remained circumscribed. You notice how these spaces, while raucous, allowed a certain privacy in public, a paradox where being seen and unseen coexisted. Sexuality here is performative, communal, and laced with humor, a relief from the strict controls of daylight hours and sober laws. You sip the ale of history and realize medieval privacy was flexible, never absolute, but negotiated through places like this. As the fire crackles and the evening deepens, the tavern's atmosphere reminds you that medieval sex was often loud, messy, and gloriously public. You leave with a smile, knowing the past's party was one you definitely wouldn't survive sober. You step into the quiet twilight of a medieval bedroom, a place that might seem like the ultimate refuge for privacy, except in truth, it rarely was. A fundamental historical fact: most medieval bedrooms were shared spaces, often communal, with thin walls and little protection from wandering eyes or ears. A quirky tidbit: aristocratic chambers sometimes featured curtains, but these were more about display and status than true privacy. Historians still argue how much actual privacy medieval people experienced during their most intimate moments, given the practical realities of their living conditions. You imagine a candle flickering shadows, dancing on rough stone walls as a couple tries to carve out a space for themselves amid constant interruptions. The concept of a private sexual encounter was fluid, often interrupted by children's servants or even guests, because walls weren't soundproof and secrets were hard to keep. You think about how these realities shaped medieval attitudes toward sex, not as a hidden act, but as an integrated part of daily communal life. Despite the apparent lack of privacy, emotional intimacy and personal connection thrived in these shared spaces, albeit in a very different way from today. You realize the medieval bedroom wasn't a secret chamber, but a stage where relationships played out in full view with all their awkwardness and charm. As you close this final door behind you, you carry a new understanding of medieval intimacy. It was never truly private, but it was deeply human. Now it's time to dim the lights, breathe out, and let these stories of shared lives and open secrets gently lull you into a restful sleep. Slow your breath as the medieval world fades softly behind your eyelids. Imagine the glow of candlelight diminishing, the laughter of taverns growing distant, and the heavy stones of cloisters cooling in the night. The echoes of public punishments, the secretive sketches in manuscript margins, and the raucous songs of taverns all settle into quiet shadows. Remember that medieval sex was woven into the fabric of everyday life, never hidden, never shamed into silence, but lived openly, awkwardly, and sometimes beautifully. As you drift deeper, feel the gentle pulse of human connection, unbound by modern walls or screens. The past whispers a truth across centuries. Intimacy is not just about privacy, but presence. Let this thought soothe you, now softening the edges of the day. Close your eyes, feel the cool medieval night air brush past, and let your mind wander free, cradled by stories older than stone. Sleep well, friend, and sweet dreams. The wind curled through narrow streets of Beauvais that morning, brushing past wooden shutters and stirring the market dust. It was early, but people were already gathering outside the stone walls of the bishop's court. Some carried bread, others gossip. Most brought nothing but curiosity. The bells of St. Peter's Cathedral rang out over the town, not for mass, not for mourning. No, these were the bells of judgment. Inside, seated stiffly on a wooden bench, polished smooth by years of elbows, and shame sat Jean de Rouet. His boots were clean, unusually so, and his tunic freshly brushed. He looked respectable, nervous, slightly sweaty. This wasn't just any trial. This wasn't theft or blasphemy or even murder. Jean was here to sue his wife, not for money, not for land, but for something far more intimate. She refused to sleep with him. He had tried everything he told the court clerk: candles, wine, reason, and yet 2 months into their marriage, he remained a husband only in name. Outside, the crowd murmured. Word had spread fast, and it wasn't just idle curiosity that brought them here. In the 14th century, a wife's refusal of the marital bed wasn't a private matter. It was a public one, a legal one, a spiritual one. And today, Jean de Rouet was asking the church to intervene in his bedroom. Jean rose when his name was called. His knees cracked a little under the silence. Before him sat a panel of 3 men, a bishop's representative in a fine black robe, a local priest who kept dabbing at his nose, and a legal scribe with ink-stained fingers and an impatient gaze. Jean cleared his throat. He was not a man used to speaking in public, but desperation sharpens the tongue. "Your Graces," he began, voice shaky, "I come before you today as a wronged husband. It has been 62 nights since our marriage, and in all that time my wife Marie has denied me my lawful rights. She will not lie with me, not once. She turns her back, bars her body, and says nothing." There were whispers, some gasps, a stifled laugh near the door. Jean pressed on, emboldened. "I have prayed, I have pleaded, I've done my duty as a husband, as a Christian, yet she refuses. This is not just hurtful, it is unlawful. I seek the church's wisdom and its judgment." He stepped back. Silence fell again. The priest cleared his throat. The scribe scratched something furiously into parchment. And then a second name was called: Marie de Ray. "Please come forward." She entered slowly. Not timidly, not defiantly, just calm. Marie de Ray was young, perhaps 20. A pale linen veil framed her face, and her hands were folded neatly in front of her, like she was attending Sunday Mass, not standing trial. The murmurs in the room softened. Eyes shifted from Jean to her, curious, skeptical, even sympathetic. Some saw a wife, others saw a rebel. She curtsied politely to the clerics. "My lords," she said, "I am here because my husband accuses me of coldness. But the truth, if it pleases you to hear it, is not that I have denied him, but that I have never been able to accept him." That stirred the air. One of the scribes paused mid-ink stroke. Marie took a quiet breath. "He is kind, perhaps, and clean. But I am not a mule to be yoked to a man I do not trust in the dark. He is impatient, rough, and not once in our short marriage has he touched me with care, only with expectation." Jean's face turned a bright, dangerous red. A few gasps sounded again, perhaps in disbelief, perhaps in recognition. Marie continued steady as a stone church wall. "If the court insists that I lie with a man who brings me discomfort and fear, then say it plainly. But do not call it duty and speak of it like Scripture. Let it be what it is, a demand, not a sacrament." No one spoke. Even the bishop's man shifted in his seat uneasy. because what Marie said, whether the clergy agreed or not, was not unheard of. Just rarely spoken, and never like this. Not aloud, not in court. To understand what Marie and Jean were truly standing on trial for, you need to step back not just a few weeks, but a few centuries. In medieval Europe, marriage was never simply about love. It was law. It was duty. It was quite literally a contract sealed before God the community. And sometimes even a crowd of neighbors watching from the windows. A husband and wife were not just expected to live together. They were expected to sleep together. And not just for pleasure, but for procreation, to fulfill the divine purpose of creating new life and populating Christendom. It was written in canon law. The conjugal debt must be rendered. Debt. That was the word they used. If one partner, especially the wife, refused, they could be charged with maleficium. A sin, a social offense, a spiritual failure. And worse, it wasn't a private failure. In the 14th century, the church had the right to investigate what happened behind closed doors, if those doors had ever been closed at all. If a wife denied her husband without cause, the church could compel her to comply. If a husband failed to perform, he could be forced to prove his virility. Not metaphorically, physically, in front of witnesses. It sounds surreal today. But back then it was routine. A marriage wasn't considered valid until it had been consummated. And if it wasn't, your neighbors might just be invited to testify. The courtroom had grown quiet again, but not from boredom. This was the part people came for. The priest leaned forward, lips pursed. "Marie," he asked gently, "do you deny your husband his conjugal rights? Have you refused him the debt owed under holy matrimony?" Marie did not flinch. "I do not deny him a right," she replied. "I deny him the body he does not know how to treat." A low murmur moved through the room like wind through wheat. Jean began to protest, but the bishop's man raised a hand. The court would speak, not the husband. Outside the window, bells rang from a passing ox cart. Inside, it was all stillness. Then the court delivered its command. "The truth must be revealed," said the scribe, not cruelly, just methodically. "If the wife claims aversion and the husband claims denial, then proof must be gathered. By church law, the husband must undergo a medical and spiritual examination to determine whether he is able to perform his duty." Jean's jaw dropped. There were whispers again. The townspeople had seen this before, once, twice. It never ended without embarrassment. "A physician and 2 church witnesses will observe the husband," the scribe continued. "He shall prove in controlled setting his capacity. Then, if required, the couple may be instructed to demonstrate the act of marriage in the presence of midwives or clergy." Jean stumbled backward. Marie said nothing. No one smiled, but more than one face twitched. Because now, what had been whispers in bedrooms and back alleys was suddenly an official matter. The church had spoken, and the bedroom had become the courtroom. The following days were the talk of Beauvais. Jean de Rey found himself under scrutiny, not just by the court, but by the entire town. A local physician known more for bleeding patients than comforting souls was summoned. 2 churchmen were appointed as witnesses, their robes brushing the stone floors as they entered Jean's modest home. The examination was both clinical and invasive by modern standards. Jean had to demonstrate his virility, a test of strength, endurance, and well-function, all while knowing that whispers and rumors would swirl like the autumn leaves outside. The physician poked, prodded, and consulted dusty medical texts as Jean squirmed under their gaze. The church witnesses recorded every detail with solemn faces, their pens scratching furiously on parchment. It was not a private matter. It could never be. The town's curiosity was relentless. Neighbors passed by Jean's house with knowing looks. Some snickered, others expressed sympathy, though sympathy was scarce for a man whose manhood was publicly questioned. In the end, the physician declared Jean not capable. Whether the truth was so, or whether nerves had betrayed him, no one could say. Marie's stance gained strength. The court ruled that the marriage had not been consummated, and therefore the contract was void. Jean's shame was sealed in the town's collective memory, a warning and a spectacle all at once. Behind the heavy curtains of wooden cottages and beneath the clatter of daily life, the women of Beauvais gathered in hushed circles. The trial was on everyone's lips, sometimes spoken, sometimes whispered. But it was in these private moments that the story took on new shapes. Older women who had survived harsh winters and harder marriages exchanged knowing glances. They had seen too many young brides like Marie, quiet, wary, and trapped in marriages that offered little comfort. A woman's body is not a tool to be forced, one wise woman murmured. Trust must grow like the spring grass, or all you get is thorns. The younger women listened carefully, some nodding, some biting their lips in silence. Many felt the weight of their own marriages more keenly now. Marie's courage spoken in that courtroom stirred something unspoken, but deeply felt a reminder that not all women's refusals were born of cruelty or laziness. Some were born of fear-pain or a simple lack of choice. Even the village midwife, a figure both revered and feared, offered her quiet support. She knew the intimate truths behind closed doors, the bruises hidden beneath dresses, the nights spent awake with worry, and the silent suffering few dared name aloud. In a world where marriage was a contract and sex was duty, the women's whispers were the fragile counterpoint, the small, brave voices that dared to question what everyone else accepted. In medieval times, the first night of marriage was no private affair. Across Europe, it was common for bedding ceremonies to take place, ritualized events, where the newlyweds were escorted to their marital bed, sometimes in front of family neighbors or community witnesses. These ceremonies served multiple purposes. They were a public affirmation that the marriage was real, a social guarantee that the couple would fulfill their duties both in life and in bed. In some towns, neighbors would even stand guard outside the bedroom to ensure the consummation took place, a safeguard against deceit or delays. Imagine a young couple, nerves raw, being led to a bed, with dozens of eyes watching the flicker of candlelight, casting long shadows across anxious faces. For many, this was an intense invasion of privacy, but it was accepted as necessary. Why? Because marriage was not just a personal contract, it was a public institution, a building block of society, family, and faith. When the first night passed without consummation, it was not merely a private disappointment. It was a failure with real consequences, legal, social, and spiritual. Jean and Marie's story was not unique. Their trial was one chapter in a long tradition where the bedroom was quite literally everyone's business. In medieval France, a man's honor and status were tied closely to his ability to fulfill his role as a husband, not just in public, but in the most private of ways. When doubts about consummation or virility arose, courts sometimes ordered men to prove their manhood. This wasn't metaphorical or symbolic. In some cases, men were required to undergo physical examinations or even demonstrate their potency in front of witnesses, usually midwives, priests, or trusted members of the community. The purpose was twofold: to protect the rights of the wife, ensuring she was not trapped in a sham marriage, and to protect the community's interest in legitimate heirs. This practice might seem shocking today, but back then, it was a serious matter tied to inheritance property and social order. Jean's case was one example. His ability or inability to perform was a public concern. Failure to consummate the marriage could lead to annulment, loss of dowry, and even social disgrace. For many men, this was a terrifying prospect. The fear of public exposure or humiliation weighed heavily on their shoulders. For the women, these court-ordered proofs could be a double-edged sword, sometimes offering protection, sometimes enforcing obedience. The church wielded enormous power over medieval marriage, declaring what was right, what was sinful, and what was required. Yet within the walls of the court, a silent tension simmered. The clergy preached that marriage was sacred and consummation a holy duty. But they also faced the messy reality, human feelings, fears, and failings. Some priests struggled with the awkwardness of ordering a husband to prove his virility or questioning a wife's refusal. It wasn't exactly the spiritual dignity they had envisioned. Faith must guide us, one cleric reportedly murmured during these trials, but faith must also temper judgment with mercy. Common sense clashed with canon law. What of consent? What of affection? What of the woman's pain? Rarely were these questions answered fully. The law was rigid, but human hearts were not. Jean's case revealed this rift between religious ideals and the complicated realities of marriage. The clergy's discomfort was visible, but their duty was clear: uphold the institution at all costs. The verdict in Jean and Marie's case rippled far beyond the courtroom wall. Their marriage was declared unconsummated and the union was annulled. Jean faced the sting of public humiliation and the loss of his bride and the dowry that came with her. Marie, though freed, lived with the weight of both relief and suspicion. In a society where a woman's virtue was currency, standing firm against her husband's demands made her both admired and scorned. Their story became a cautionary tale, whispered at firesides, a reminder of the power struggles hidden beneath marriage's surface. In the years that followed, both would carry the scars, visible and invisible, of a time when sex was never private. Looking back, Jean and Marie's story teaches us much about medieval society, about power, privacy, and the body. Sex was never a private act. It was a social obligation, a spiritual duty, a public contract, and marriage a battlefield where personal desires often bowed to communal rules. Today we might find the idea of public proof or bedding ceremonies strange, invasive, even shocking. But for the people of the 14th century, this was the norm. Their lives remind us that privacy, consent, and intimacy are not universal constants, they are cultural inventions, and they change. So when you close your eyes tonight and think about the past, remember this. What we take for granted now, our private bedrooms, our personal choices, was once a very different world. A world where sex wasn't private, and where even love had to pass the judgment of others. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world very different from our own, where the idea of privacy, especially when it came to love and intimacy, was almost non-existent. In medieval times, behind the thick stone walls of castles and cottages alike, there was little room for secrets. Sex wasn't a private act, shared only between two people. It was a duty, a public concern, and sometimes even a matter for the courts. Tonight, we'll step back to 14th century France, to a small town where a marriage unraveled not in silence, but in the bright, uncomfortable light of public judgment. This is the story of Jean and Marie, and why in their time sex simply wasn't private. So settle in, breathe deeply, and let's travel back together.